Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. And I'm really excited about the show that we have today. We have 3 different guests on today, and they're all talking about different topics, but it's really interesting and making a well-rounded show.
No doubt. Glad to be with you today, Renee. I'm really looking forward to. We have an old friend that's been with us before, Mr. Robert Bean. Robert Bean is a forester with the Kentucky Division of Forestry. He's out of the Campbellsville branch, kind of in central Kentucky. And Robert's continuing a series that we've recently started where we kind of checked in with each of the branches to see some of the kind of common issues that they're dealing with in each of those branches. So Robert's going to be here representing that Campbellsville branch. I'm talking about some of the stuff they're seeing in their area. We also have Dr. Ellen Crocker here with another issue of pesky plants. That's always a really good thing. She's also got a new survey coming out about invasive plants and some leaf curl issues and some other things that she may be able to debut as well. And we have our good old friend, Dr. DJ McNeil, doing another Wings of Kentucky segment. And he's looking at kind of some of those late summer birds that we might be seeing. So a well-rounded show, Renee, and it's really good to be here with you on the campus of the University of Kentucky on move-in week.
Exactly.
Got undergraduates and their families from all over the country moving into the University of Kentucky, but we're excited to be with you all today, and thank you all for being with us. If you have questions for our presenters, you can use the chat function, or if you're on YouTube or a podcast listener, you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu, and we'll get a response back to you that way. But delighted to be with you again here today, Renee.
Yes, thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and get started. Robert, if you'd like to turn on your camera. Hi, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you joining us.
Greetings.
Hello.
Yeah. Now let me get this right. So there's 6 different branches across the state that KDF has. So basically, it may not be in your county, but there would be a branch for every region, I guess, if you were to put Kentucky into 6 different regions.
Right. Yeah. And our branch covers 27 counties.
Okay. That's a lot of counties.
It is.
All right. So kind of started this, like Billy mentioned before, is that we're kind of seeing what is going on in the counties, so like what you would represent those 27 counties and kind of what you're seeing in your neck of the woods, so to speak. And so we're kind of trying to do a series on that so that each one of them will have a different, some kind of a different topic of what's going on. And I know today you have a specific topic about leaf curl symptoms that you're seeing.
Yes.
Okay, so if you want to go ahead and start your presentation, that'll be great.
All right. Now, if I can do that, let's see.
Down to the share.
Green share button.
Share button, share screen, and there. Aha.
Coming up. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Right. Okay, so what I'm seeing, and this is through the kind of the northeast part of our region, is leaf curl, and it's happening on a variety of species. The thing I'm most concerned about is oaks, but it hits a bunch of species, and what it does is it looks like herbicide damage. So, and I'm pretty sure that's what it is, but I don't have any way of proving it. We've never been able to actually confirm detect any chemical involved in this, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But it runs across the region, and what we see is in the early spring, the developing leaves are curled like you see in this picture. And it happens throughout the woodland, and it happens on many different species. And it's been happening for a long time. I sent my first samples showing this effect to the turned them into UK Extension, trying to find out what was going on back in 2012. So it's been more than 10 years that this has been going on. Let's see. So this is kind of the area that I work. If you'd see, this is central Kentucky, kind of centered in E-Town. And of the section that I work, this is where I really see it year after year after year. And so in this area, you're going to be hard pressed to find an oak this time of year that you cannot find symptomatic leaves on. And if you look, you'll find that it hits a lot of other species too. So this is kind of what you'll see is distorted leaves. And this effect is, I mean, it's typically what you would expect to find with something like 2,4-D or possibly dicamba. But what the leaves should look like is this. And so what's happening is those leaves are not properly formed, so they aren't properly photosynthesizing. And so like this is a tree in my yard, and the crown is just not nearly as full as it is. At the tip of the branches, you can see a few leaves that are normal that broke bud later in the year. So, but the initial flush of leaves are all affected. So my suspicion is that the early spring burn downs are causing this issue. So the chemicals are drifting through the atmosphere and hitting areas. Sometimes some of these places that I see this effect are quarter mile from the nearest crop field. So traditionally, when I've seen herbicide drift issues, I'll see it adjacent to the field. And if you walk into the woods a little bit, the damage drops off significantly. In this case, what it is entire woodlands are impacted with this. We had the Forest Service come out and do an assessment at Lincoln's birthplace and then looked around Lincoln and Hardin counties this year, and they found 29 different species of tree and shrub and some herbaceous plants that showed the signs. So one of them is redbud, and you'll see these curled and smaller leaves, and they should be looking like this. But yellow poplar shows it. There's a lot of species. We've tried doing sampling to figure out if we could detect any of the chemicals. So we've sent off samples and nothing's come back as positive. But the sampling company was saying that the dosages that we're looking for are really small and these chemicals break down very quickly. So if you're not sampling pretty much when they're spraying, you're not going to find it. So in this case, we tried other things. We covered up some to see if we could protect them. And the leaves look better here, but they aren't properly developed leaves either because the bag had impact. So we weren't really able to determine that protection made for better developed leaves. But it's all across the landscape in this area, you'll see it. And this is at Lincoln's birthplace, and the leaves of the trees are just not properly developing. And my concern is mostly on where I'm really concerned is white oak, because we'll see these mature white oaks in a lot of species. The leaves start off curled, but they'll continue to grow and put out another flush of leaves or continue to put out more leaves that are properly developed. And so they're photosynthesizing properly throughout the year. But on these white oaks, these mature white oaks, they just aren't doing that. So you'll see their crowns are really thin and they're not photosynthesizing properly. So this is, 10 years of that, I'm starting to see some of these bigger white oaks in decline. And that just really concerns me. And I'm finding it hard to, if I have a landowner that has trees in this condition, in the past, I would have, those trees are young enough and would have been vigorous enough to where I wouldn't be thinking that they might need to harvest them. But it certainly is a concern now if they're starting to show some decline in the crowns because they haven't had fully developed leaves for years. That is a big concern. So it's things that make me think this is herbicide is it's multiple species. And it's been year after year. We've never been able to detect any fungus or insects that are associated with this across the board. I mean, it's unusual for an herbicide as it is across the landscape. So we're seeing it, well away from the forest's edge interior. And so it is a big concern there. All right. Let's see. Oops. And that's pretty much sums up what I have to say. If I can figure out how to get back to me.
I can do that for you. There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, so what I'm seeing is that oak curl, and it hitting other species too, yellow poplar, many species, and but it is across that entire area. And it seems to be tied to, in my observations, to agricultural, particularly bean and corn production. When you move into the areas where it's more livestock, the effect seems to be muted. There's not as much of it.
It's very interesting what's going on there, Robert. Have you heard from other foresters in other parts of the state? Are they seeing similar things?
Not very many around here. Some of them a little further south have seen it to some extent. In my region, I've have a friend that lives up in Illinois, and he's seen it up that way. Um, but I haven't seen it, I've not talked to very many people that have paid attention to it or noticed it in other parts of the state. I think that it must be there, but we haven't been able to find it. We've talked to the Department of Ag, and they look at the damage and they agree it looks like herbicide damage. It's just so hard to track down and actually pinpoint that that's what it could be. But I mean, it can happen so far away from the nearest agricultural field. So it's not
Yeah,
like it's not a
right.
normal drift. It's becoming volatilized and becoming part of the atmosphere and drifting across large swaths of territory as
Wow.
opposed to just right next to the field.
Yeah, it's something I'm not very familiar with at all. I have heard of that in the past, but yeah, to see that kind of widespread over a multiple county region certainly is a little bit concerning.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is really I mean it is throughout that area, and it's pretty much, if you start to look for it in the area I outlined on my map there, you're going to be hard pressed to find trees that don't show it.
It looks like it's pretty much over the entire tree. It's not just certain sections. Is that right?
Right, yeah. So it's the entire tree, it's trees in the understory, it's throughout throughout the canopy. Um, you can move in, several hundred yards into the woods and all those trees are still affected.
Hmm. Okay.
Uh, yeah, whereas, in the past, if it was normal drift, it would be really bad right up against the field edge and then fade drastically as you move into the woods. And that's just not what's going on here.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Very interesting.
No puzzler.
Yeah, I know. We need to figure out what's going on there, right?
Yeah,
I,
definitely.
I agree. We've had the Forest Service come look at it. The Department of Ag's looked at it. KSU is looking at trying to do some samplings next year. The Division of Forestry, we've tried sampling, although our sampling stuff has not turned up anything.
Mm.
Hmm.
Wow.
Um,
The
so
puzzler. Yeah.
it is a puzzle. And it's just year after year of improperly developed leaves is hard on those trees, particularly those big mature white oaks.
We did have a question. Someone actually asked if it could be residential applications rather than agricultural. So do you think that's a possibility? I mean,
It I mean, residential applications could impact the trees that are in an area. It's just the quantities normally wouldn't be so big to go across in such a big area.
Mhm.
So like, I don't know if you're familiar, E-Town has a park called Freeman Lake. The first picture I was showing is from a tree in the middle of Freeman Lake Park, which is significant distance from any normal application.
Hmm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Wow, Robert, I want to hear more about this as we kind of uncover what's going on with that. So,
Yeah. Have
let,
you back
let,
on.
let us know once we kind of uncover the mystery.
Yeah.
And I think Dr. Crocker's joining us as well. She might
Mhm.
have a comment on
We're
this.
going to talk a little bit about a survey, I think, that trying to figure out what actually might be happening here.
Yeah, so I want to thank you, Robert, for joining us and telling us about what you've been seeing in your area, and look forward to hearing, from different parts of the state what some of the key things that they've noticed are. As Robert mentioned, this is something that we really don't have a lot of answers on, even what's causing it, where it is we've observed these symptoms, and some different folks, Department of Ag, the Forest Service, have had some suggestions about what's happening, but we really don't know what's going on. And appreciate you, Robert, putting this on people's radar. And what I'm going to ask is, if you're watching the show today and you've seen symptoms like this on your trees, would love to hear from you. So if you're seeing these kind of oak leaf cupping symptoms, distorted growth, that kind of thing that Robert just showed you a lot of pictures of, we want to hear from you. So we've got a really short survey about these leaf cupping, leaf curling symptoms. And you can go on there and let us know what you're seeing. Again, while we don't really know what's causing this, we want to be able to have a better idea of where it is occurring so that we can start to follow up on that in greater depth. So if you have seen these kind of things, let us know wherever you are in Kentucky, on oak trees in particular. We want to hear from you. And I'll put the link in the chat as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Right.
and we'll try to help you distribute that link in other places. So look for it on social media or off our website or whatever if you're a podcast listener.
Yep, most definitely.
Great.
All
Yeah, and
right.
a lot of different things can cause weird leaf symptoms in oak trees. There are insects, there are diseases, there are environmental issues. But this is something that, as Robert mentioned, has been happening for many years and seems to be increasing. So we really would like to assist in getting better information about that.
All right.
Sure, with you two on the on this, something's gonna happen. I have no doubt about that.
Well, it's a tricky issue and something that I think there's no simple answer on, So just trying to find out more.
We did get a question that just came in about is it the same trees that are affected year after year, or do the affected ones eventually just die?
It is the same trees year after year. Some of the trees in the affected areas are in decline, and there have been some that have died. I would suspect that it's not solely because of this, but it's a contributing factor. Particularly if where these trees have been affected like that 10 years in a row, that's just it adds an additional stressor that any other stress comes on, makes the tree much more vulnerable.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we've learned from Dr. Crocker over the years here that there's like this little death spiral that happens, right? These compounding factors start building on one another, and it'll slowly take the tree out, or quickly, depending on the case. But I'm really glad to hear that Dr. Crocker is looking into this, Robert, and is trying to survey the area and kind of get a better handle on what's going on. And certainly do appreciate you drawing attention to this issue. Anything that's a threat to our oak species is a big concern, right? Because we are an oak hickory forest. That's our dominant trees are oaks and hickories. So anything that's a threat to them is really concerning. So
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah,
that.
it's, I mean, it does hit all sorts of species. So it hits yellow poplar and everything. It's just that particularly late in the season right now, you can see the impacts on the oaks because they don't flush again, and the leaves are obviously not functioning to their potential.
Okay.
All right. Well,
All right, okay.
we'll look for an update on that down the road, and
All
I'm
right.
sure Dr. Crocker will keep us appraised as that survey kind of unfolds, and we get some results from that as well.
Thanks so much.
Okay. All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Appreciate you, Robert.
Bye.
Thanks for all you do, and thanks for all the Kentucky Division of Forestry does. We certainly appreciate y'all very much. You're such a critical partner when it comes to trying to manage woodlands here in the state. So thanks for all you all do in that regard.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye.
Awesome.
So, next we have Dr. DJ McNeil. He's going to be talking about basically the birds that you're seeing right now. And so we have a video from him. He's not able to join us, but he did do a video for us on, basically what you can see out your window. So if you want to go ahead and play that.
I'll get her going.
Welcome to another installment of Wings of Kentucky. Today we're going to be talking about late summer bird observations, birds that you might be seeing this time of year in late summer. There's a variety of really interesting phenomena and some interesting species that do interesting things that we can see this time of year. Hopefully I can get the audio to work. If not, we'll just have to roll with the visuals. We'll see what Zoom has in store for us here. So one of the first things that you might notice about birds in this time of year is that things are a lot quieter, right? When you get up in the morning, you're not going to hear the robins like you did back in April, right? You might still hear some robins singing, and I heard one singing today, mockingbirds, cardinals, things like that are still vocalizing, but nothing like they were doing back in the springtime. Every bird on every tree, heads tilted back, singing like crazy. The other thing that you'll see, and we'll talk a bit more about this as well, is birds just looking rough and scruffy. And the thing is, what you're looking at when you see a bird is mostly feathers, right? It's got a beak, it's got eyes, and it's got feet, but otherwise you're mostly looking at a bird's feathers. And feathers are a really great mode of protection for a bird, but they don't last forever. And in many cases, by the end of a year or even 6 months, depending on the species, some of those feathers are looking pretty rough. So this American robin here, you can see it looks pretty different than this one. In addition to being potentially different sex, this bird is looking real patchy, and that's because some of its old worn feathers, which it's still wearing, have fallen out and are being replaced. You could sort of see some of these other newer feathers coming in here. And the idea, or the kind of physiological phenomenon, the process of shedding feathers and regrowing them, is what we call molt. And a lot of birds this time of year are molting their feathers. So that is very apparent while looking at some of these birds in the field. Now, in addition to seeing birds molting their feathers and seeing birds that are no longer singing and territorial, a lot of birds are finishing up their reproduction for the year. So, for instance, mallard ducks like these guys here aren't as pretty as they once were. So these, this guy and this one in the background and this one here, these are 3 males. This bird here is a female. Those 3 males, they look really similar to the female. In fact, you can see that they've got a lot of these sort of brown feathers in here, much like the female. So mallards are a species, they've actually spent much of the summer looking very drab and dingy. Mallards and a lot of our ducks, they actually breed really early in the year, and they start actually courtship in winter time. They really get a good head start on things. So in the summer, that is like their off season. They almost have a flipped reproductive cycle. But so you're seeing a lot of birds that are finishing up with their breeding for the year. Maybe this is a mama mallard and a bunch of her juvenile and young birds. So you see a lot of that. And of course, we're also seeing a lot of like really old babies. So these would be nestling barn swallows. They're getting ready to fledge the nest any day now. And we're seeing a lot of fledglings around as well. Now, in addition to fledglings, which are babies that are dependent upon their parents, we're seeing a lot of juveniles. So juveniles are birds that have fledged the nest. They spent time as a fledgling for a little while, getting fed by mom and dad, and they now are completely on their own and just learning to be a bird. So this looks pretty different than the American robins we're used to, but this is a juvenile American robin. So notice that it's still got that reddish breast, this kind of dark head and dark back. but a lot of these feathers are about to be replaced with the pre-formative molts. So that's a fancy term for sort of the fall molt. All these little spotted feathers are going to fall out and be replaced with solid colored feathers. This head plumage is all going to be shed and replaced with like a sturdier, nicer looking plumage that resembles the adult feathers. And most of these spotted wing feathers are going to be shed as well. Although in many species, the robin included, they may retain a couple of these little spotted feathers that help us to identify it as a young bird later on. Now, this is a juvenile American robin. Here's a young cardinal. It could be a female, it could be a male. They're difficult to sex at this point. And you can tell it's a juvenile and not a adult female because it has this dingy dark colored bill. By the time the bill is orange, as is the case for a adult cardinal, males will have developed that red plumage, at least in part, and females will kind of remain drab like this and have that orange bill. Here's a red-bellied woodpecker, adult male here on the right. He's got that nice red that goes all the way to the base of the bill. And a juvenile here has no red at all. That's often very confusing bird when you see this at your feeder, and you can see he's begging for food from the adult. And of course, we see birds like this Carolina wren. The plumage may be relatively similar to the adult plumage, but like just scruffier, kind of fluffier looking. It's not as crisp. It's not as protected, which is why a lot of birds, as soon as they molt or they leave the nest, they quickly get enough energy to molt out of that young juvenile plumage and into some adult-like plumage, which is how they spend the winter. Now, this slide I know says American goldfinch breeding, and that's what I'd like to talk about here. But bear with me, this is a robin, and this is a figure showing the life cycle of the robin and when different life events happen. So for instance, this circle here is when body molt and primary flight feather molt happens, which is July, August, and September. So our birds are currently molting, regrowing those feathers. Migration, you can see we've got a fall migration and a spring migration, but that's actually not what I want to focus on. Let's look at breeding. So this one here is when they have young in the nest and when they have eggs. So they have eggs starting in April through the end of July and young through mid-April through mid-August. So right now our birds are just finishing up their reproductive activities in the American robin. But DJ, you have American goldfinch on the slide. Well, the reason I have that is because the American goldfinch is a really cool life cycle. So let's just focus right in on that breeding period. So you can actually see they're nesting in July and August, and they have their fledglings out into September. So this is a really cool bird. They line their nests with thistledown. It's a species that nests almost later than the vast majority of our breeding birds. And when I think of late summer birds, I often think of the American goldfinch just because it is such a late breeder. This time of year, when these robins are all getting ready to head south, and probably some of them already are, and they're gathering in flocks, American goldfinch are still like fully in breeding mode. We're like at the middle of the breeding season for American goldfinch, and they are just really just a very conspicuous member of the bird community this time of year. So here's that male American goldfinch feeding on thistle seeds there. Some of the things that you're going to hear a lot of this time of year. So this is a female American goldfinch. You can see that she's kind of a dingier yellow than the male. In the breeding season, the male has that black cap and the female does not. In the winter time, you can tell them apart by wing color. The female has kind of this grayish brown wing and the male has black, like a jet black wing. This is one of the calls that you're going to hear a lot this time of year produced by American goldfinch. Now, it doesn't sound very special. It doesn't sound like much. It's just a little something. But the way that I remember it, and a lot of people use this mnemonic, is either perchicory or I learned it as potato chip. Or patiti, but I like potato chip. So listen again, you'll hear this potato chip call a lot this time of year. It's produced by adults, usually when they're flying, but not always. The other thing that you're going to hear a lot this time of year are male songs. So here's that beautiful male. He's got much blacker wings, brighter plumage overall, and he's got that nice black forehead. Here's the beautiful, it's very complex, kind of a jumbling song. Sometimes they mix the potato chip in there, but here's that complex song of the American goldfinch, only given by adult males. Now, the other thing that you're likely to hear is this call here. So here's a juvenile American goldfinch, or possibly a fledgling. It's hard to say. He's probably right around that age that he's becoming independent of mom and dad. Very drab plumage overall, usually some yellow on the face, dark bill, and kind of these drab wings. Now, they've got this intricate pattern with pale markings on the secondaries and tertials, and these sort of two pale wing bars. The call that they produce a lot, I learned it as the chickpea call. Sounds like they're saying chickpea over and over. And that call is usually given by fledglings when they are harassing their mom and dad for food, just like these little guys are here. And you can probably sympathize with this poor mother goldfinch who has her hands full with these three fledglings all begging for food. Now, our beautiful male goldfinch is looking something like this right now, but within a few weeks, he's going to start transitioning toward this much more drab winter plumage. Now you can see that a lot of males have a lot more yellow on the face than the females, and the wing plumage actually does not really change, neither does the tail much. In fact, if you were to open the wing or take a really careful look at that front of that shoulder, he actually, even in the winter, he keeps that little bit of yellow there, that he kind of splash of yellow, and obviously those jet black wings he keeps all winter long as well. Ah, yes, this gremlin-looking cardinal here. So this is another thing we see a lot in late summer. So we see like birds like this northern cardinal that absolutely look hideous and diseased. I think they look kind of cool in a certain sense. But for some reason, our cardinals and blue jays, it happens with other species too, but for whatever reason, these birds, these really big crests, they have a tendency to molt their head plumage all at one time, and they're not necessarily diseased. I mean, this is not a sign of disease. This is kind of a normal thing. They don't all do it. I don't know what percentage of birds do it. It seems like some do it and others molt a little bit more gracefully. But don't be surprised if you see a blue jay that looks like this one. That doesn't mean that he is diseased. He's just undergoing quite a molt. And actually, see all these little pin feathers, as they're called, these little nubs? They kind of look like mechanical pencil lead or needles or something. Those are actually growing feathers. So actually, your bird may look like this for a while, which is pretty unsightly, but eventually those pin feathers are going to continue growing in. He's going to look a bit more like that. Give him a week or so, he's going to look more like that, then that, and then finally he's going to be back to his old self. I've never seen a good explanation for why these two crested species tend to do this, but it's a fairly common thing and not unusual. The other thing that a lot of birds are doing this time of year is they're building up fat for their fall migration. So here's a picture of a skeleton of a pigeon. And these two areas around the cloaca and right here around the wishbone called the furculum, these are areas where birds tend to store a lot of fat. So here's a little image of a bird here. I'm not sure what kind it is, maybe a warbler. And here's kind of where the head and the tail would be oriented. And you can see this little glob of yellow fat on the bird on these two ends. That's where that bird is storing fat for migration. Another really cool thing we see this time of year is flocking. So here's a big flock of common grackles, and it looks like there's a European starling snuck in there as well, which are technically not blackbirds, but they often associate with blackbirds. A lot of blackbirds that are semi-solitary or totally solitary or just in pairs. during the breeding season, form these big flocks. Here's a big flock of red-winged blackbirds. There are probably some brown-headed catbirds and things in there too, which are blackbird species. A lot of these birds form these big, either single species blackbird flocks or mixed species blackbird flocks, something very cool to look for this time of year, and becomes more common later in the summer as these birds form these flocks that they spend the entire winter in. Here's another red-winged blackbird flock. There's some starlings mixed in there as well. So, so be on the lookout for that. And then finally, the last thing is actual migration for many species begins in August. I mean, some of the first migrants are coming through. You'll see juvenile yellow warblers like this one that are in their drab fall plumage, or species that kind of look the same all year round, like our thrushes and this Swainson's thrush here, looking for a safe route down to the tropics to spend the winter. With that, I will leave it there, and that concludes this month's Wings of Kentucky. I'll be looking forward to next month when we cover, well, we'll see what we cover at that time. Either way, looking forward to it, and thanks for tuning in.
It's always really interesting to see what he's gonna, bring forth for us, to see the different birds. A lot of times you don't even really, I don't know, I don't even notice some of them. And then he brings them to my attention. Like last night I was sitting breaking beans from my garden and I saw a yellow finch. I didn't know it was a male until just now. And he was calling just like that. I was like, okay, well now I know what he was. So it's kind of cool.
It's very cool. I really appreciate those segments and Wings of Kentucky. You getting to learn about kind of the birds that, some of us don't really see that often, right? Or that up close. So I really appreciate Dr. McNeil for putting that segment together. It was
We
really
really do. And he does a great job, and he's great to, just say, hey, yeah, whatever you need. So I really appreciate him.
Oh, yeah, he is so good. He's a great instructor as well. I have a chance to co-teach our Forestry 100 class, and we bring him in as a guest lecturer, and he is such a good instructor as well. So, yeah.
I've went with him when they're bird catching with a group of, students, and it's really neat to see him, talk about all the different birds and, what they do and that kind of thing.
Certainly very glad to have
Fascinating.
him. I'm glad to have him part of our department for sure.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Speaking of someone
Of
else
our
who we're glad
department.
to have.
Yes, I know. Who we absolutely love, Dr. Ellen.
Exactly. Can't do
Hey.
it without Ellen. How are you, Ellen?
Oh, the feeling is mutual. It's a dream team over here.
Dr. Crocker, how are you doing today?
Doing great, doing great. Today I'm going to talk about a pesky plant. And usually in this segment, I profile some invasive plants. But today I am not bringing to you something rare that you've never heard of before. No. Today we are with the top of our invasive plant list, at least for central and northern Kentucky. And I'm going to be talking about bush honeysuckle.
Yes,
We can always use a refresher.
Nemesis, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Crocker, I've been in central Kentucky for a few years now, and I remember a time when it was not as abundant as it is today in our woodlands. So I'm curious to hear what you've got to say about it. I know it is a booger that we've had to deal with for a while, though.
Yeah, and it's one that I think if it's not on your radar that this is an invasive plant and a problem, you're like, oh, it's green, it's got these nice flowers, it's got to be good. But once you start to see it and know the problems it can cause, it is like, whoa, this is everywhere. If you are in central northern Kentucky, this is the plant that has totally taken over everywhere. So yeah, and it's something that's increased a lot in the past 20 or so years.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Looking forward to it.
Great. So again, today we're going to be talking about bush honeysuckle, a fast-growing shrub that can form really dense thickets and take over. I tend to think of it in forest understories, but it can also be a problem in old fields, roadsides, edges, and other places. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what bush honeysuckle is, why it's a problem, and how you can control it. So what is bush honeysuckle? I know that some of you watching today are probably like, you don't need to tell me about bush honeysuckle. I know all about it. But if this is a new species for you, it's a really fast-growing, early colonizing plant that's able to outcompete native plant species. There are actually several different species of Asian bush honeysuckles that are invasive here and can cause problems. In our area, Lanicera mackii, amber honeysuckle, is by far the most common invasive bush honeysuckle. But depending on where you are, where you're listening from, there might be other similar species that occur that do similar things, other invasive bush honeysuckle species. All of which are considered invasive. So something that's noteworthy about invasive bush honeysuckle is that it leaves out earlier than most native species, and then it retains its leaves longer. So in this picture, you can see what it might look like in late February or early March, well before most of our native species have started leafing out. This plant has its leaves out, and that lets it be productive for longer than other plants and is part of why it's so successful. And other things to note about it, it has this multi-stemmed form, and it can grow really thickly in this dense kind of layer, as you can see here, that excludes other species in a range of different light conditions. So low light, shady areas to more medium and higher light settings. While it's commonly found like this as an understory shrub in forests and woodlands, you can also see some really large plants that look more like small trees, like this landscape specimen I found. This is pretty tall, really big stems, but still has that multi-stemmed form. Bush honeysuckle is a problem because it takes over our natural areas. It shades out and excludes plants, forming this dense monoculture of nothing but bush honeysuckle. But a couple other reasons why you might not like bush honeysuckle. First, the leaf litter is thought to inhibit the growth of other plants, being allelopathic. So not only is the honeysuckle taking over, it might impact things in the soil for some time afterwards. In addition, invasion by bush honeysuckle has been connected to changes in wildlife and bird populations. Not only do you have the same thing on repeat, which means that it's going to be good for the things that can use that resource and not so much for the ones that can't, it produces a lot of berries at a particular time of year, which again might be useful for some species, but not for others, kind of like the junk food of the plant world. Also, invasion by bush honeysuckle has been connected to an increase in tick populations and an increase in tick-borne diseases. So another thing I don't want to see, and I bet you don't either. No one wants more of that. So how can you identify invasive bush honeysuckle? Many people are familiar with these white to cream colored flowers. When it's in bloom, it's covered with these, and they're kind of held right on the stem. And then those develop over time to these red berries. A single bush can produce tons of these berries, which are then eaten and spread by birds. And you can see those berries again are kind of held right there on the stem. Its leaves are opposite each other across the twigs and branches. So what do I mean by that? I mean, here you've got one leaf and another leaf, and they're just opposite the stem from each other. One leaf, another leaf, just opposite the stem from each other. And the buds are as well. So if you look at those buds, even in the winter, you'll notice this, that they're just across from each other. That can be really useful in at least narrowing down to some plants, but some plants, many plants have alternate leaves where they kind of zigzag on a branch. These are going to have the leaves and buds that are opposite each other on those stems. So another thing that I mentioned earlier, but is really useful in your ID, is that early leaf out of bush honeysuckle and also the long retention of those leaves. So this is a photo from, I think, early November of bush honeysuckle. And, because it has its leaves on for longer than most native plants and gets them earlier, you can take advantage of that window of time to find it more easily in your woods. And also, it can be a little easier to work in your woods when everything else has lost its leaves. What are some potential lookalikes to bush honeysuckle? Well, the one that I can confuse it for the most would be another understory shrub, but one that's native called coralberry. And you can see a picture of it here. Now, coralberry does tend to stay a little bit lower. Its leaves are going to be slightly different, maybe more rounded and softer, and then its berries are going to look quite different. So once you get an eye for it, you can distinguish them pretty readily, but you can see it kind of has the same opposite leaf arrangement that can trip you up at first. Another understory shrub that you might see in your woods, sometimes a lot of it, and wonder if it's an issue, would be spicebush. Spicebush is a native plant, but sometimes it can be really dense. Now it does have different leaves and it has alternate leaves, so some ways that you can distinguish it. Those leaves have a real fragrant smell when you crush them up or break them. That's another distinguishing feature. And then its flowers and seeds look really different. The flowers, it's going to be one of the first things to flower early spring, before those leaves are even on, these beautiful yellow flowers. And then right about now in the fall, you're going to see these seeds, these fruits forming. They start out green and then they turn red over time, but a shiny red color, very different from the honeysuckle seeds. And then we do have another invasive honeysuckle. We mentioned the bush invasive honeysuckles, but there is also vining invasive honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle. So it looks really similar to bush honeysuckle in a lot of ways. The things we've talked about, the flowers are kind of similar looking, the leaves are similar in opposite arrangement, but it's a vining form, not a bush form. So a cousin to our invasive bush honeysuckles, that's also a problem all by itself and can carpet over areas. Now there is a native vining honeysuckle, but it's relatively rare and looks pretty different. The flowers are a coral color, and a way to distinguish that if you were to come across it from this other invasive honeysuckle would be those flowers. There's some differences in the leaf form, as well as the fact that the stems on those are solid, while the stems on both the Japanese honeysuckle and the bush honeysuckle are going to be more hollow on the inside. So a few potential lookalikes there for bush honeysuckle. When it comes to management of any invasive plant, bush honeysuckle or something else, you're going to want to have patience and persistence. Prevention is typically the best management option. If you can get rid of it before it becomes a big problem, find it when there's just a few stems and control that, is a lot easier than trying to deal with a dense thicket of it. Now, unfortunately, for many folks, that's not the scenario they find themselves in. By the time they notice bush honeysuckle being a problem, that ship has sailed. So management approaches really depend on the severity of the infestation, what else is growing with the bush honeysuckle or other plant you might want to retain. So you don't want to be hurting the native plants you're trying to keep, because what you're really trying to do is get rid of bush honeysuckle, of course, but what you're really trying to do is promote the health of your woods, promote those other species you want to be seeing. So because bush honeysuckle commonly forms these dense thickets in the understory of woods, it's going to be important that you're protecting those large trees and any other valuable native plants that you want to keep. I would recommend that you think about management of invasive plants, prioritizing the areas where you can have the greatest impact. Where are you going to see really positive effects? Maybe starting with areas that are a little bit better off. You just have a few bush honeysuckle here and there, and moving your way out from there. It's a lot easier to see a big positive impact than starting with something that's solid bush honeysuckle. That's going to take a lot more time and effort. So when it comes to different management approaches, there's lots of them for honeysuckle, and it just depends. So if you've got seedlings or very young plants, you can pull them up either by hand or with a tool to assist. Here you can see someone doing that, trying to get as much of that root system as possible, because that's important. Otherwise, it will sprout right back up. You could also do repeated cutting or grazing, but if that's not done really regularly, you're going to get lots more honeysuckle shoots sprouting right back up from where you removed that one. Mechanical removal alone of large plants on a large scale will result in extensive site disturbance, which is great for establishing new invasive plants, and likely leave a lot of root fragments. So something you want to balance there. For larger plants, cut stump herbicide application, as well as basal bark herbicide applications and other stem-based approaches can be really useful since they'll target those individual plants, but not impact other things nearby. So here you can see someone cutting that individual stem and someone spraying that herbicide on that cut stump, and they're done. While there are a number of effective herbicides for this approach, glyphosate and triclopyr are commonly used. Whatever you're doing, remember to follow the label instructions. Typically, doing something like this, you're going to use a much more concentrated herbicide solution than you would for a foliar concentration. And you're going to be really disappointed in the results if you're spraying at a foliar rate for something like this cut stump approach. So speaking of that foliar herbicide application, that can be a good option for smaller plants where you can easily apply the herbicide to the leaves. Late fall is a good window for this because honeysuckle still has its leaves on. Other plants have lost them. It gives you this window of time where you're unlikely to be damaging other things around there. But also make sure you aren't spraying too late. If the leaves have started really turning yellow, it's not going to be effective. There are even some examples of aerial herbicide spray with helicopters. I know our Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources has been doing some exciting work at Clay WMA testing that out. Lots of potential there. A number of herbicides work well for foliar spray and forestry settings, but make sure to always follow that label and wear the appropriate protective equipment. So for more extensive infestations where things aren't interspersed with stuff you want to keep, you could prepare an area by mechanical removal, bush hogging, or using a forestry head for those larger kind of tree-like plants, followed by maybe treating those cut stumps with herbicide or a foliar herbicide spray late or in the season or in the following spring to get what's sprouted back up. Whatever you're doing, you're going to be needing to plan long term. So long term, you need continued scouting and management. Seeds are going to continue coming up from the seed bank. New seeds are going to be introduced from birds. In some cases, prescribed fire can be a really useful part of long-term bush honeysuckle management. Although fire alone is probably not going to be sufficient to control it, another great tool in that toolbox. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me today and learning a little bit more about the invasive plant bush honeysuckle. If you want to learn more, you can reach out to us or check us out online. And thanks to all of you for fighting invasive plants and promoting the health of your woods. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share.
Well, thank you. We greatly appreciate you doing that because it's a good refresher for all of us.
Yeah, no doubt. I was trying to say thank you, Dr. Crocker, for what you're doing. I appreciate that. That is certainly one that we fight all the time in Kentucky. So to remind people of that and what we can do is really valuable.
It is. And I talk to a lot of folks who, they cut them all down and did a lot of work, a lot of great work with that. And then they came right back. And that's so frustrating and so discouraging. And so, when it comes to management, really doing your research and making sure that the approach that you're taking is going to be effective long term, because you can cut down all the bush honeysuckle you want, but if it just shoots right back up, it's important to take that into account. Maybe that's okay, and you can work around that with your management. Maybe you want to follow that up with an herbicide that's going to help kill the root system of the plant as well. So even though we know it and we know it well, it still can be a huge challenge.
Yes, indeed. And we had a couple of questions come up. Somebody was asking about herbicide rates for the cut stump treatment.
Yeah, I'd really recommend that everybody check the label. Every one of those labels is different. Now, for forestry applications, some commonly used herbicides would not be what you can pick up from home, like Home Depot or Lowe's. You would get something that's going to be more concentrated and mix that at the rate that you want. So commonly for something like a cut stump, you might use triclopyr containing herbicide like Garlon at a rate, again, specified by the label, because there are lots of different formulations of even something like triclopyr or Garlon. But many times that won't be at a 1-to-1 rate with water or a stronger rate. Whereas something like a foliar herbicide, that might be, for example, at like a 2% rate. So you can see those are really different concentrations. And if you were to use a foliar rate on a stem-based approach, it would not be as effective. So encourage you not only to do some research into that, but instead of just kind of using what you've already got or what they've got at the hardware store, make sure you're using the right tool for that job.
Yeah, it's such a great point. You know,
Oh, and another tip, if you're doing a cut stump approach, make sure to add some dye in there, because it is surprisingly easy to lose track of what you have treated and what you have not. You know, all those cut stumps kind of look the same. And if you've got a sea of them, you know, you're like, did I treat that one or did I not? They do make marking dye that, again, you would mix that up and make sure you're using something that's going to be compatible with the herbicides you're using, but it'll help you keep track of things.
They did ask too if it could kill a shrub, so I'm assuming they mean the cuts stump
stuff.
approach. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, that's a commonly used approach for many invasive shrubs, including bush honeysuckle. But there are others, and not at all. We did not cover everything today, but just some of the common approaches. It's really going to depend, and is part of why it's so great to work with a professional. If you've got, you know, you're starting to think about this in your woods and what you should do, talking with somebody who's been in similar areas, done similar things, and can speak to that. We also had a question about its allelopathy. Its ability to inhibit the growth of other plants through chemicals and its leaf litter exudates. That's a really great question. You know, what does this mean for long-term other plants being able to establish? I will say that a lot of native plants can do kind of similar things. So it's not like this is going to salt the earth and prevent things forever, but you might see some legacy effects from that bush honeysuckle. You may want to wait a little bit if you're seeding into an area that you've removed honeysuckle. I think it would probably be a little easier for plants that were larger if you're transplanting things in there, but it might take a little while for things to get back to a kind of more baseline there.
Mhm. Someone did share that bush honeysuckle does have some medicinal purposes. You can make teas and things like that. And I know you have actually said made a pesto out of some, I think it was winter creeper, right? So if you
I've
haven't,
never tried honeysuckle, and if
you might
you
make
have now Japanese honeysuckle, I know that people do make teas with the flowers and have had those before. They're really fragrant and have a nice smell. Now, I've never heard of bush honeysuckle being used for those things, but I'm learning new things every day and can't wait to learn more. Feel free to share those with us. I am all about making lemonade when life gives you some lemons, and some garlic mustard pesto when life gives you invasive plants.
Right.
So I think if you can use those, I've seen some beautiful art projects and fences and different things that have been made from those honeysuckle branches. So by all means, we have enough honeysuckle for
I was
you
going to
to
say,
do
let's
whatever
make a
you
lot
want.
of tea, right? Yeah. We can get
Exactly.
really healthy with all the
Let's get rid of that, you know. So, definitely. All right.
Oh man, good stuff, Dr. Crocker, as always. We appreciate what you're doing really on so many fronts to kind of keep an eye out for what's going on with our forests and natural areas.
Yes.
It's really important. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
All
Great
right.
show,
Awesome.
Renee.
Yes.
Yes.
Learned a lot today on several
Yeah.
different fronts.
And some things, you know, we don't have all the answers for, right? And
Right.
we're just going to have to keep searching for some answers on some of those. But we certainly do appreciate Robert Bean coming on and sharing some of the stuff that he's seeing out of the Campbellsville branch. And you know, we're going to keep that series going. We'll be hearing
Right.
from other foresters across Kentucky that worked with the Kentucky Division of Forestry. We've asked them to kind of highlight some of the things they're seeing in their area, may be of interest to others. So big thanks to Robert and all of KDF for their support. And also appreciate Dr. DJ McNeil, did a great Wings of Kentucky segment. We got to learn a little bit about some of these birds we see in the summer, and we always appreciate what Dr. McNeil does for us. And then Dr. Crocker brought home kind of one that we know about, but we can't forget about, right? And that's
Right.
honeysuckle. So don't
Yeah.
forget about the obvious thing that's all over our area. So
Exactly.
appreciate y'all being with us today. It was a good show, and Renee, always a pleasure to be with you as well.
Yes, I appreciate you joining me every week too, Billy. I really do. And we appreciate you because we wouldn't have a show if it wasn't for you watching us. So thank you so much. And tell your friends about it. You can go to fromthewoodstoday.com and you can sign up for reminders. You can send us show ideas. You can answer surveys. There's a little bit of everything. And also, every show we've ever had, which is over 200, is also on that website.
Yeah, so check it out, and we would love to hear from you all. So give us some show ideas, show topics, right?
Definitely. Until then, we will see you next week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
From the woods today. From the woods today.